In medieval times, dating, sex, and marriage could decide your entire future. But what was it like for people back then compared to today? How did intimacy actually work in medieval life, and does it feel more familiar than we expect? This is a story about people trying, sometimes desperately, sometimes creatively, to live with intimacy in a world where the risks were higher, the rules stricter, and the margins for error razor thin. Yet, when we imagine medieval romance, the image that often comes to mind is simple and stark. We think of situations such as a young woman bartered into marriage, a grim-faced husband chosen by her parents. No love, no choice, no passion, just duty. But the truth is far more human and far more familiar. Medieval people fell in love, they gazed at each other, they flirted, they had crushes, and they had longing for each other. Like today, they made foolish and bold choices, and sometimes disastrous ones. They worried about whether the person they liked them back. They exchanged tokens, they gossiped, they dreamed. And just like today, love could be joyful, awkward, exhilarating, heartbreaking, and occasionally scandalous. The difference was not that medieval people lacked romance, it was that romance unfolded in public. There were no private dinners, no secluded walks without consequence, and no disappearing into bedrooms behind closed doors. Love happened under watchful eyes. Parents, employers, neighbors, priests, and entire villages who noticed everything. And yet, despite that, or perhaps because of it, medieval courtship developed its own rules, rituals, and quiet rebellions. For most people in medieval Europe, romance began not with dating apps or carefully curated introductions, but with proximity. You fell for the people you lived and worked beside, and as most people in medieval times hardly traveled more than 30 miles from where they lived, this meant your choice of romance was limited. For example, apprentices lived in their masters' households, often alongside daughters of a similar age. Young women left home to work as servants in other homes, bringing them into daily contact with young men they were not related to. And in villages, farms depended on shared labor, and teenagers moved constantly between households, fields, barns, and markets. So love did not bloom in isolation. It grew from familiarity. A medieval teenager's first crush was likely someone they milked cows with, carried water beside, or shared a hearth with on winter nights. It could be someone whose laugh they knew by heart, someone whose absence was suddenly noticeable. Romance crept in quietly, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore. Even in towns and cities, where trades were tightly regulated, young people mingled constantly, and markets were the social theaters for those looking for a potential partner. Church was also one of the few places everyone gathered at once. Whether it was feast days, festivals, weddings, and seasonal celebrations, it created opportunities where glances could linger a moment too long, and conversations could stretch just beyond politeness. And then there were medieval tournaments. For the nobility, tournaments were not just martial displays, they were elaborate performances of identity, beauty, and desire. Knights would dress in their finest armor, decorated with colors, ribbons, and symbols tied to women they admired. And love was celebrated, praised, sung about, and exaggerated until it became something almost sacred. Then, in the High Middle Ages, a new idea emerged, one that would permanently shape Western ideas of romance, and that was courtly love. Courtly love was not about marriage, it was about yearning, discipline, and suffering. It wasn't practical or sensible, and that was the whole point. In courtly love stories, a knight devoted himself to a woman, often married, often socially unattainable, and he proved his worth through obedience, bravery, humility, and self-control. He did not expect marriage. He did not even expect physical intimacy. The value lay in the longing itself. To modern ears, this sounds absurd. Why pine for someone you can never have? But in a rigid feudal world, courtly love gave people something rare, and that was emotional expression without social upheaval. Knights who would never inherit land, never secure powerful marriages, suddenly had a purpose beyond violence. Love became a code of behavior, a way to channel desire into honor rather than chaos. And women, especially noble women, gained something too. Within courtly love, women were idealized as moral authorities, and the knight existed to serve, to prove himself worthy, and to refine his character. And in a society where marriages were often transactional, courtly love offered women a form of symbolic, emotional, and social power that did not threaten the structure of inheritance. It was fantasy, yes, but it was meaningful fantasy. And these stories spread quickly. Troubadours traveled from court to court, singing tales of devotion, heartbreak, and sacrifice. And love became something to perform, to narrate, and to aspire to, even if real life rarely matched the poetry. Yet courtly love did not replace real-world courtship. It existed alongside it. For ordinary people, romance was practical. Courtship was not a prolonged affair. There was no concept of dating for years. Once interest was established, families took notice, a match was discussed, resources were considered, and reputations weighed and time mattered. Most common people did not marry young. Despite popular myth, medieval peasants often married in their late teens or early 20s. Before that, they worked, they saved, they learned skills, and this was because marriage required the ability to set up a household, obtain a home, accumulate tools to enable one to work, even have animals, or trade connections. Of course, love did matter in medieval times, but survival mattered more. Parents generally expected to approve of a match, but that did not mean they always chose it. Many marriages were negotiated, but consent was legally required from both parties. Without it, the marriage could be contested. Yes, coercion existed, but it was not the rule. And love had a way of complicating everything. If a young man and woman exchanged gifts, such as a ring, a girdle, or a brooch, it was not a casual act and taken seriously because these tokens carried meaning. They were promises, intentions, and declarations. Mirrors, combs, rings, and decorated pins were especially popular. Some were engraved with phrases like, "all my heart," or "of good heart." And archaeology confirms what the poetry at the time suggests. These were deeply personal items, worn close to the body, meant to be touched, seen, and remembered. One spur found on a battlefield bore the words, "In loyal love, all my heart." This shows that a man had ridden into war carrying a declaration of affection with him, perhaps the last thing he thought of before dying. So love was not abstract, it was worn, carried, and risked, because if you declared it, it could cost you your honor, protection, or everything you depended on. Courtship itself took place in public spaces. Couples walked together, talked together, worked together, and were always visible, and this was not accidental. Visibility protected reputations because privacy invited suspicion and rumor. And a girl's honor mattered deeply, not because medieval people were uniquely obsessed with purity, but because honor was tied to family survival. A damaged reputation could destroy marriage prospects, alliances, and economic security. That is why young love was watched so closely. But supervision did not eliminate desire. It sharpened it. A glance across a crowded church, a hand brushing during a shared task, a moment alone at a market stall while others were distracted. Each moment showed that medieval romance thrived in stolen moments precisely because they were so rare. And widows and widowers re-entered this world too. Medieval life was dangerous and death was common. Many people married more than once, and so remarriage was not only acceptable but expected. Widows controlled property, ran households, and often had more freedom in choosing partners than younger women. So the marriage market never truly closed. Yet for all this romance, one truth hovered over every courtship. Marriage was not the goal of love in the way we understand it today. Marriage was an institution, legal, economic, and spiritual. Love might inspire it, it might grow within it, but it was not required. And this tension between love and marriage defined medieval relationships. People wanted affection, companionship, and passion, but they lived in a world where marriage bound families, not just individuals. And that tension created stories, it created poetry, it created rules and endless ways to break them. By the end of the Middle Ages, even the calendar reflected romance. February became associated with choosing partners. Hearts became symbols of devotion. Flowers and seasons mirrored desire. And these ideas feel modern to us because they survived for centuries. So medieval people did not invent love, but they gave it structure, symbolism, and language that still shape how we think about romance today. And yet, love was only the beginning. Because once desire was acknowledged, once courtship crossed certain invisible lines, and sex was inevitable, society had something to say about it. And that is where things became complicated. Very complicated. Desire was never absent from medieval life. It pulsed beneath the surface of every village, town, cloister, and castle. The church may have preached restraint, but medieval people were acutely aware of their bodies, their urges, and the consequences of both indulgence and denial. In fact, one of the great misunderstandings about the Middle Ages is the idea that people were ignorant about sex. They weren't. They were surrounded by it, in animals, in jokes, in songs, in medical texts, and in religious warnings that described forbidden acts in vivid detail, often far more vivid than necessary. Medieval people did not need to be told that sex existed. They needed to be told when not to have it. According to Christian teaching, sex had one legitimate purpose: procreation within marriage. Pleasure was tolerated only as a side effect, never as the goal. This was rooted in theology but reinforced by law, medicine, and social pressure. And yet, reality stubbornly refused to comply. The Church inherited a powerful phrase from St. Paul: "It is better to marry than to burn." And burning did not mean hellfire alone, it meant burning with desire. So, lust was expected, it was universal, and what mattered was control. This is where medieval thinking becomes surprisingly nuanced. Both men and women were believed to experience sexual desire intensely. In fact, many medieval medical and philosophical texts argued that women were more lustful than men. This idea may sound strange today, but it shaped how medieval society viewed female sexuality, not as passive, but as powerful and dangerous if unchecked. Women were warned about their gaze. Looking could inflame desire. And according to medieval theories of sight, the eyes were active, not passive. They emitted rays. To look was to touch. To be looked at was to be affected, and desire passed through vision like an invisible current. This is why modesty was emphasized, why women were encouraged to lower their eyes, why flirtation was dangerous, not because it was meaningless, but because it worked. Privacy, meanwhile, was a luxury few possessed. Medieval homes were crowded, beds were shared, walls were thin, and entire families lived and slept in single rooms. Even married couples had little space to themselves. And yet, sex still happened. In fact, the lack of privacy may have intensified desire rather than diminished it. So, secrecy required ingenuity. Historian and medievalist Ruth Mazo-Caras famously noted that churches, dry, quiet, and empty for much of the day, could serve as medieval equivalents of the back seat of a car. So, sex at times was not romanticized behavior. It was practical, and when desire is thwarted, it will find a way. And medieval literature did not shy away from sexual description either. Short comic tales called fabliaux, that were popular in France and England, were filled with adultery, deception, lust, and bodily humor. They were meant to entertain, but they also reflected lived experience, and people laughed at them because they recognized themselves. And even dreams were eroticized through these stories. One of the earliest recorded descriptions of a wet dream appears in a 12th century Byzantine novel, describing physical sensations so intense they left the character trembling, breathless, overwhelmed by pleasure. And medieval writers did not lack the vocabulary for desire, nor did medieval medicine. Medical texts discussed sex openly, sometimes in shocking detail. Some works offered advice on how to be a better lover, how to delay ejaculation, or how to ensure a woman's pleasure. One 10th century text advised men that a woman's orgasm should coincide with his, especially the first time, because that was the best way to ensure lasting affection. Evidence that this is not the language of repression, it is the language of experience. At the same time, sex in the medieval age was surrounded by many rules, such as entire calendars of forbidden days, which included Sundays, Thursdays and Fridays, feast days, Lent, Advent, periods surrounding childbirth, menstruation and breastfeeding. The list was endless. When all restrictions were added together, a married couple might be permitted to have sex less than once a week, at least on paper. In reality, enforcement varied, and confession mattered more than policing. People sinned, repented, and sinned again, and the church understood this cycle well. For example, early medieval manuals for confessors, called penitentials, catalogued sexual sins and assigned penances. Masturbation, oral sex, same-sex acts, and even sexual positions were scrutinized, and only one position was officially approved, because it was believed to produce the least pleasure. And yet the very existence of these rules proved something important, and that was that people were doing all of these things. After all, the church did not invent rules for behaviors that did not exist. Contraception, for example, was officially condemned, but widely practiced. Examples include women who breastfed to delay conception, couples who used withdrawal, some engaged in non-penetrative sex, and herbal remedies were known, and passed down orally from woman to woman. We know this because priests were instructed to ask women when in confession, "Have you drunk herbs so that you might not conceive?" Names of plants appear repeatedly in condemnations, such as pennyroyal, rue, willow, juniper, and Queen Anne's lace. This knowledge survived not because it was written down approvingly, but because it was denounced and declared to be wrong or evil. Abortion was also considered a serious sin, but even here medieval attitudes were complex. Early pregnancy was often viewed differently from later stages. This was because the concept of ensoulment mattered more than conception itself, and an ensoulment was the moment a living being, especially a human, receives a soul. As for sex outside marriage, this was officially forbidden but tolerated in certain contexts. For example, prostitution existed in almost every medieval town. It was regulated, taxed, and monitored. Authorities believed it was better for men to visit prostitutes than to seduce respectable women or commit what were considered worse sins. Consequently, prostitutes were seen as necessary evils, absorbing male lust to protect social order. And with all this sexual activity, sexually transmitted diseases was a real concern. Medieval people feared leprosy, gonorrhea, and other infections long before syphilis appeared in Europe. They connected sexual behavior to illness, not only morally but medically, and treatments were brutal, such as cutting and burning of the flesh, using lime or vinegar, and even bloodletting, so sex could heal or kill a person. Too much sex was dangerous too. Medieval medicine believed semen was a refined product of blood. Excessive intercourse depleted the body. Even noblemen were said to die of sexual excess. Others were warned to abstain or risk death. But too little sex was also dangerous too. Celibacy posed medical risks, especially for young men. Retained semen was believed to cause anxiety, headaches, wasting, even death. This created a profound tension for priests and monks, bound to lifelong abstinence. Some coped through fasting, bleeding, cold diets, and bitter herbs, while others quietly broke their vows. And jokes about sexually active clergy were everywhere, because the behavior was common enough to be funny. And even women were thought to suffer from retained sexual fluids. A condition known as suffocation of the womb could cause fainting and illness. Some physicians recommended stimulation, even masturbation as treatment. This was morally uncomfortable but medically justified. And though the church frowned upon it, medicine sometimes insisted. Same-sex desire also existed, but it was categorized differently from today. Medieval society did not think in terms of sexual identity. Acts mattered, not orientation. Sodomy was condemned regardless of who performed it with whom. And punishments varied, such as penance, exile, and sometimes execution for repeat offenses. But discretion saved lives. Intense same-sex friendships were common and often tolerated if unconsummated, yet some relationships left faint but heart-moving traces. For example, two knights buried together after 13 years at each other's side, their coats of arms joined in death. Love, unspoken but unmistakable. Despite all this regulation, all this fear, all this contradiction, sex remained a central part of medieval life. It was discussed, joked about, feared, desired, regulated, abused, and cherished. It was never simple, and eventually, desire crossed into obligation. Because once sex became acceptable, sanctioned, legal, and legitimate, it did so within one institution that shaped medieval life more than any other: marriage. And marriage in the Middle Ages was both shockingly simple and endlessly complicated. Marriage in the Middle Ages was many things at once. It was a legal contract, a religious sacrament, a financial arrangement, a social alliance, a moral safeguard, and, sometimes, a love story. But it was never just one of these things. To our modern eyes, medieval marriage can seem paradoxical. On the one hand, it was treated with profound spiritual seriousness. On the other, it could be created with a few words and a shared bed. No priest, no church, no witnesses, and no paperwork. Just consent and consummation, and for centuries, that was all it took. If two people spoke words of present consent, I take you as my husband, I take you as my wife, and then had sex, they were married. Permanently. Even if no one else knew, and even if conditions had been attached, and even if parents objected. This simplicity created chaos because people could be married without realizing it, or married more than once, or claim marriage years later when it became convenient. That's why lawsuits over marital status flooded church courts during medieval times. Entire lives could unravel over whether a promise made in youth counted as binding. So the church eventually stepped in. In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, Pope Innocent III attempted to impose order, and marriages now required public announcement. Bans, which are notices read out on 3 successive Sundays in a parish church, had to be read aloud so anyone with objections could speak up. Secret marriages were also discouraged, though never fully eliminated. Consent remained paramount, and marriage could not legally exist without it, and this mattered deeply, especially for women. In theory, forced marriage was invalid, but in practice, coercion was difficult to prove. The line between pressure and consent was thin and often crossed. Some women married their abusers. Some married men who had kidnapped or raped them because their reputations had been damaged, and marriage offered the only path back to social acceptance. The law tried to protect them, but society often failed. Once married, the expectations were clear. Marriage was permanent, and divorce, as we understand it, did not exist, but annulment did. A marriage could be declared invalid if it should never have existed in the first place. Common grounds included being related by blood, or sharing a common ancestor, or impotence, or lack of consent. Astonishingly, failure to satisfy one's spouse sexually could also be grounds for annulment. In some cases, courts investigated a husband's sexual capability, and they did this by calling witnesses, and sometimes prostitutes were brought in to test claims of impotence. Marriage was not just about producing heirs, it was about fulfilling obligations. Sex within marriage was considered a duty owed by both partners, known as the marital debt. Either spouse could demand it. Refusal without good reason was sinful. And this legal equality did not mean equality in practice. And that's because the dynamics of power favored men. But it does challenge the idea that medieval women were expected to be sexually passive. But surprisingly, a woman's desire was acknowledged and even expected. The wedding itself varied enormously depending on wealth. Most weddings were modest. Couples wore their best clothes, and they didn't wear white like most people do today. Brides often received a new girdle from their groom, symbolizing both chastity and commitment. Rings were exchanged if affordable, vows were spoken, and the priest blessed the union. And because weddings were public affirmations that two families and two households had become one, the feast, food, and celebration mattered, as it was a form of letting the community know that these ties were made. For royalty, Weddings were spectacles with lavish tournaments, days of feasting, and entire cities transformed, and princesses were celebrated twice, once as brides and once as queens. And then came the wedding night. Contrary to popular myth, most medieval people were not ignorant about sex. They had grown up surrounded by animals, they heard jokes, they shared beds, they witnessed childbirth, they listened to bawdy songs and festival humor. So sex was not mysterious, it was consequential. For a marriage to be unquestionably valid, it needed to be consummated. This placed enormous pressure on the wedding night. Ideally, both parties were virgins, especially the bride, because lineage mattered. But virginity was not always checked. Bloody sheets were not universally displayed, plus many couples had already slept together. Once married, being faithful and loyal to your spouse was demanded, at least officially. And adultery was a serious offense. Punishments ranged from fines and public shaming to violent retaliation. And women were punished far more harshly than men, largely because pregnancy betrayed them and could be easily seen. Among elites, male infidelity was often tolerated. Mistresses were common, illegitimate children acknowledged, which showed the double standard between classes and was glaring and destructive. Yet emotional fidelity mattered too. Medieval letters reveal affection, longing, and tenderness. Others tell us that husbands worried about wives during childbirth. Some were from wives mourning their husbands lost to war or disease, and some marriages, arranged or not, grew into genuine partnerships, while others did not. Marriage could be lonely, brutal, and restrictive, especially for women trapped with violent or indifferent husbands. The church preached patience, endurance, and prayer. But even unhappy marriages could not easily be escaped. And still, marriage remained the backbone of medieval society. It structured inheritance, defined legitimacy, stabilized communities, and controlled sexuality. It was the bridge between desire and duty. But marriage was not the end of the story, because medieval people did not stop being sexual once wed, nor did they stop fearing death. And nothing brought those fears together more intensely than pregnancy and childbirth, which is where the risks became very real. If marriage marked the point where desire became duty, then childbirth was where duty met fear. For medieval women, pregnancy was both expected and dangerous. It was celebrated, prayed for, feared, and endured, sometimes repeatedly, sometimes fatally. Childbirth was the most perilous moment of a woman's life, and everyone knew it. Birth usually happened at home, surrounded almost entirely by women. Female relatives, neighbors, and midwives took charge. Men were excluded. This was women's knowledge, women's labor, and a women's crisis. The room would be warm, crowded, thick with prayer, and charms were spoken and amulets were worn. Birth girdles, long parchment scrolls covered in prayers and sacred images, were wrapped around the mother's body for protection, and saints were invoked by name, such as the Virgin Mary, Saint Anne, or Saint Margaret. And Saint Margaret mattered most. According to legend, she had been swallowed by a dragon and burst forth alive by invoking the name of Christ. For medieval women, this made her the perfect protector, one who understood being trapped, crushed, and fighting to emerge alive. Labor was long. Pain was expected, but pain was also theological. According to Christian belief, childbirth pain was the legacy of Eve's sin, so relief was not sought eagerly. Painkillers did exist, but they were rarely used because endurance was praised. Midwives worked with their hands. They turned babies manually. They lubricated with butter, oils, or herbal mixtures, and relied on experience passed from woman to woman, not textbooks. And if labor went wrong, there were few options. Forceps did not yet exist. Caesarean sections were performed only as a last resort, often when the mother was already dead or dying, because infection was almost guaranteed, but survival was rare. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. So was maternal mortality. And yet, medieval parents loved their children deeply. This is one of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages, that parents were emotionally distant because children died so often, but the evidence says the opposite. Parents named their children lovingly. They commissioned toys. They prayed obsessively for their safety, and mourned intensely when they died. Graves were marked, prayers were repeated, and loss was remembered. And grief did not vanish because death was common. It deepened it. Babies were often swaddled tightly, and breastfeeding was the norm, especially among poorer families. But for many women, nursing a child after birth delayed further pregnancies as it allowed mothers some physical recovery, though few would ever name it as contraception. Among the wealthy, wet nurses were common, and this was because aristocratic women were expected to produce heirs quickly, and nursing children interfered with that expectation. Babies were handed over, but emotional bonds still formed between mother and child, just differently. And in the medieval times, childhood itself was not ignored either. Children learned early. Mothers were often the first teachers, teaching reading if not writing, and religious imagery reinforced this, such as Mary teaching the infant Jesus from a book was a powerful symbol. Girls learned household management. They learned to run estates, manage servants, and act in their husband's stead when necessary. Consequently, medieval women were expected to be competent, not decorative. As for boys, they followed different paths. Some went to church schools. Some trained for trade. Noble boys trained for war. And literacy opened doors to law, medicine, administration, and power. So family life was not sentimental in the modern sense, but it was invested. Children mattered because survival and lineage mattered, and memory mattered too. Marriage, sex, and birth were not separate stages of life. They were a cycle. Desire led to union. Union led to risk. Risk led to loss or legacy. And throughout it all, medieval people wrestled with the same contradictions we do today. They wanted love but needed security. They desired pleasure but feared consequences. They trusted faith but relied on experience. And they hoped for joy but lived alongside death. What makes medieval dating, sex, and marriage so compelling is not how alien it feels, but how familiar it becomes the closer you look. These were not people trapped in a joyless past. They laughed, they flirted, they cheated, they prayed, they worried about satisfying their partners, they feared illness, they negotiated family pressure, they stayed in bad relationships for practical reasons, and they mourned lost loves, and they cherished children. The rules were stricter, the risks were higher, the margins for error were thinner, but the emotions were recognizably human. And in many ways, the foundations of how we understand romance today, such as Valentine's Day, giving love tokens, yearning, jealousy, and devotion, were shaped in the medieval world. Not because medieval people invented love, but because they tried, desperately and creatively, to live with it. And love, sex, and marriage still remain some of the greatest gifts each of us give and receive as our lifetimes evolve, an unmistakable beauty of being human. If you've enjoyed this journey into medieval life and love stories of the past, enjoy relevant visuals, and appreciate history documentaries, don't forget to like and subscribe to Obscura Historia today.